What you want to do is think about how you can keep that workload to the absolute minimum. And then that way, if something does start to happen to raise that workload, you have tons of capacity to make up for it. And to manage that workload, I use a couple different techniques. One of the biggest ones is structured configuration points, essentially gates that I'm flying through on an instrument approach procedure, and I need to meet certain criteria: speed, configuration, autopilot configuration, as I go through those gates. So there are really three specific points that I'm looking at on an instrument approach procedure. The first one occurs as I'm transitioning onto the approach. The second one occurs right before my final approach fix. And then the third configuration point for me occurs as I begin my missed approach. So let's take a look at that first point. To make things simple, we'll start assuming we're beginning the procedure at an initial approach fix. So I always want to cross that initial approach fix at a specific speed and a specific flap configuration. In the Cirrus SR22 Turbo, I always cross it at 120 knots indicated with my flaps clean. Now my next configuration point happens right in front of my final approach fix. So when I'm using vertical guidance, I am going to slow to my final approach speed of 100 knots, and I'm going to set my final approach flap configuration of 50% flaps. When my glide slope or glide path reaches 1/2 scale deflection. I found for me, that gives me the right amount of time to slow from 120 knots down to 100 knots in level flight, and then intercept my glide slope, make another power adjustment, and I can fly that right down the final approach segment. Okay, now let's talk about my missed approach configuration. I'm going to transition initially to VY 103 in our Cirrus, and then I will climb at VY with my flaps still at 50% until I've cleared any close-in obstacles, and then I will retract my flaps and transition to a cruise climb once my cruise climb meets the climb gradient requirements for the procedure. Remember, your standard climb gradient on a missed approach procedure is 200 feet per nautical mile unless the notes or instructions say otherwise.